very pleased to have with us as our next speaker on a subject of really great importance that permeates a lot of other issues as well as standing alone. It's cybersecurity. Chris Painter is a coordinator for cyber issues at the U.S. State Department and has a long record of being deeply involved in these issues diplomatically. He has been in the White House. He's been a presidential international strategy for cyberspace, his to implement. He dealt with the China issue. I mean, there's a long list of things that he's been involved in. And truth is, I'm tired of biographies, but we've got somebody who has got a hand in all of the relevant key issues, has understanding, I think, from the government's concern about security and cyber protection, but is sensitive and also understands how important for the private sector having the right kind of system in place. So let me, without more, just ask him to come forward and what you have to say with a lot of interest.
Well, thanks. It's good to see you. Some of you I know, some of you I don't know. I've been. So I wanted to sort of do a tour de table, if you will. It's a diplomatic term of all the things that we're doing internationally in cyber policy, which does really. There's a spectrum of this, everything from the security issues that were mentioned through to the human rights issues and internet freedom and internet governance and practically everything with respect to the internet you can imagine. I should first say that my current incarnation is now we've been there 3 years. Back 3 years ago, they established my office in the Department of State in the Secretary's office, coordinator for cyber issues, really cyber policy issues. And that was a recognition of a couple of different things. It was a recognition that these were becoming much more of a foreign policy priority, and these were not just technical issues, but real policy issues, and that there were lots of different parts of these issues that, whether it be the security issues or the human rights issues or the governance issues, that we needed to bring together and really up our game, up our voice on these. So my office now just recently celebrated its third anniversary, and it doesn't seem like it's been that long, but that's been a pretty long time. We've grown from about 4 people to 14, including one of my senior advisors who comes from the private sector, Liesl Franz, who's over there. We were the first office of our kind in any foreign ministry in the world that was focused on these cyber policy issues. And since then, about 14 other governments have emulated this, really across the world, both governments that we work closely with and also those who we maybe don't always work closely with. So it's become clear that this is much more of a policy issue and a foreign policy issue, and it's maturing as that, which I think is important. I think all of you have seen often these issues start as technical debates, but they are far more than technical debates. They really define issues of social policy, economic policy, and security policy, and they really have to be understood in that context. Indeed, back one of my experiences, I've been doing various aspects of cyber now for about 22 years. I started as a prosecutor going after cybercrime cases. I went back to the mothership of justice, then I went over to the White House, and now I'm at the State Department. So I've seen different aspects of this, and one major transition I've seen over that period is that it used to be when you talk to policymakers, particularly senior policymakers, and this was true in government, but it was also true, I think, in industry, about issues involving cyberspace, whether it be cybersecurity issues or other issues. They viewed these as such technical issues that their eyes would glaze over or they'd run screaming from the room. There wasn't this understanding or view that they needed to grapple with these issues, and they'd often relegate it to within companies, usually the CSOs or CIOs, within government, usually the experts who were dealing with this, and they weren't grappling with this at a higher level. But I think there has been a real recognition this is far more than that. And I think that was in part engendered during this administration when President Obama came in. And you may recall that when President Obama was running for office during the first campaign, his campaign was hacked into, and certainly that brings the issue home, especially the cybersecurity issue home. And one of the first things he did when he came into office was he set up a review group to look at all of our cyber policy, cybersecurity policy more specifically, and we produced a report that talked about where we were and where we needed to go. And the other thing that he focused on, we created a structure at the White House to deal with that. And the other thing we did during that first couple of year period is we produced the first of its kind of document, the International Strategy for Cyberspace. And this is the first time any government had done this, where we looked at all these different issues, again, from human rights through to security, through to military uses in cyberspace, and tried to put them all into context. This was an interesting document for several reasons. One, it was a message to the rest of the world of where we stood on issues. Two, it was a message to our own government where we stood on issues so that everyone would be pulling in the same direction. And we had an overarching goal to have an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information and communications infrastructure, that all of those were important, that you weren't going to just have security at the expense of openness. You needed both. You needed interoperability. You needed a partnership, as you all know, between the government and the private sector and other stakeholders to achieve this. You needed these things to be based on norms of behavior. So if you haven't looked at the document, which is now 2 years old, I recommend it. It's something that's been the framework, the grounding principle for all the things we've been doing internationally. And several other countries, again, have been looking at that document and producing documents that are similar. I think, when you do a document like this, the fact of doing the document itself is helpful, because one of the things I noticed when we were putting together is, first we got all the different federal agencies, and there were made about 22 agencies and departments come together to try to decide how this thing would look. And it started out as creative cacophony, and it ended up being this really, I think, very useful roadmap of where we are, where everyone understood where they fit. But it was also something we shared with and talked to the private sector quite extensively about, and that was an important part of it too, given the role the private sector has in this area. And so this has been the kind of cornerstone, the groundstone of all of our diplomatic efforts. One of the things, there were different areas that I wanted to highlight under this. And I mentioned that the international strategy spanned this whole range of different issues. There are several different issues, buckets as I call them, under that, and I want to just talk about each of those buckets a little bit, some of the things we've achieved. I don't want to talk too long because I do want to have some questions and answers, because I think that's the most important part, frankly, in many ways. The first area or bucket is international security in cyberspace, and that's distinguished from cybersecurity. This is more the issues around cyber conflict or preventing cyber conflict. Obviously, this is not just a government issue. The private sector has a view on this too, given that the infrastructure, once again, is largely owned by the private sector. And we continue to work to develop shared understanding about norms of acceptable state behavior in cyberspace, which will help enhance stability, ground foreign and defense policies, guide international partnerships, and help prevent misunderstandings that lead to conflict. So even with the many challenges over the last year occasioned by disclosures and other issues, we've made real substantial progress in this bucket. In 2013, something called the UN Group of Government Experts, which is 15 countries that include the US, but it also includes China and Russia, came to a landmark consensus that international law applies to cyberspace. And that may seem like something that everyone takes for granted in this room. It's like, well, of course international law, why wouldn't it apply to cyberspace? But there was real doubt about that. There were some countries that were saying that you need a whole new legal construct for cyberspace, particularly around international security issues, and things like the law of armed conflict and the UN Charter, and those issues didn't apply. You need something else. And that's a very dangerous concept if you think about it, to have totally different rules for cyberspace and for the physical world. And so this group report said, yes, international law applies. It also said that states should not be using proxies to achieve what they couldn't do under international law. It talked about capacity building. It talked about some other aspects of cyberspace. And it talked about the concept of confidence building measures. And this is what states do. This is the one, people try to draw analogies to different things in cyberspace all the time, and I'm sure you all heard all these analogies, and they always fall short. There never is a really good, on all four sort of analogy, and some people try to draw analogies in kind of cyber conflict to the nuclear world, which really doesn't hold water. But there are some things that are transferable, and the thing that I think is transferable is the idea of confidence building measures, and that's building confidence between states that are maybe frenemies, maybe are hostile to each other, Maybe there's not a lot of transparency, but you want to build greater transparency and understanding between those countries so that you avoid the risk of escalation and miscalculation and possible problems down the line. And that was something that was true in the nuclear age, and I think it's important to do that in cyberspace as well. And it's a new concept in cyberspace. And the U.S. has pioneered this around the world, where we have said that we need greater confidence building measures, and this is not rocket science. I mean, it is, transparency measures are just that. They are things to build transparency between countries. Cooperative measures, which are the next stage up in the pyramid of confidence building measures, are things where you cooperate against third-party threats. And then finally, stability measures are the tip of the pyramid, which would take a while to reach, where you try to get more stability in this area. So over the last few years, first, in this group of government experts, we've been pushing this, and the report reflected the confidence building measures were important. Second, we actually did bilateral confidence building measures. And then third, within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, back in their ministerial meeting, which was in Kiev, by the way, in December, which I was at, the foreign ministers there blessed the first ever multilateral confidence building measures to build better transparency and understanding, points of contact, exchanging information, exchanging certain technical information, sometimes having hotlines. There's a number of these things that are being explored, and so that's been very important. And we're also trying to branch out into other areas like ASEAN, the Asian ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum. So it's not just European-centric. We're trying to do this around the world. And indeed, it was mentioned that one of the many things I have the privilege of doing in this job is I chair our U.S.-China working group that was created after the Obama-Xi summit in Sunnylands. And we've had a couple of meetings in that group, and one of the things that we've been raising there is this idea of building better transparency and confidence between the U.S. and China on a lot of these issues. So we're taking this in a lot of different forms. These are practical measures. Even if countries can't agree on some of the policy issues, they can at least agree on ways that we can make sure that we're not, that conflict doesn't inadvertently arise. So we're working on that. The second big bucket of activity is around internet governance. And there is, I think, an emerging area, internet governance is an emerging area for a struggle for openness in cyberspace. And the United States and many others in the international community have been steadfast in supporting an inclusive, multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And what that really means is that governments don't get to call the shots exclusively. Governments have a role. So do the private sector. So do civil society. Everyone has a piece of this, and no one gets the final say. And that really is the way the internet, as you all know, has grown up. I mean, it would not be nearly the platform it is today. It would not nearly have the reach or the power it does if this was run completely by governments without the other stakeholders involved. And quite frankly, there is a dispute there. There are some governments who have a totally different view of the internet, who believe that we need to have greater state control. They have various reasons for doing that. They want to have a intergovernmental rather than a multi-stakeholder approach to running the internet. Some of them have this view because they don't like what's happened with the internet. They believe that things like dissenting conduct or dissent on the internet are themselves threatening to their regime stability, and therefore they think that government should have a bigger role in tamping down that kind of content, where we think that the exact opposite, that we want there to be an open platform that is governed by everyone in the community. So we have very steadfastly objected and opposed, with many of our allies and others in the world, efforts to try to impose a more intergovernmental system on the internet and to promote a more inclusive multi-stakeholder environment. And of course, this is going to be one of the things that gets discussed throughout the year at various forums, but including at the Internet Governance Forum that's going to be held at the end of this year, as it was just discussed at the Internet Governance Forum in Bali last year. It will be discussed at the Brazil conference. The Net Mundial conference is coming up in April. They will be discussed in a lot of different forums, but that is a key thing. To maintain that kind of the openness and vibrancy of the internet really requires this multi-stakeholder system. The third area, which is, I mean, all these are overlapping and related, and that's why we really have to think about these as a whole, is the area of human rights and internet freedom. You know, we have seen increasing threats to internet freedom, and a lot of the reports out there have clearly demonstrated this. Data from the OpenNet initiative says that 960 million internet users live in countries that impose illegitimate restrictions on content, and that is 47% of all internet users. So it's more important than ever that the US government continues to work to ensure the availability of individuals worldwide to exercise their fundamental freedoms online. And this involves several things. One, promoting the existing consensus that international human rights obligations and commitments apply to online activity. There was another landmark thing that happened in the last year, which is the UN Human Rights Commission had a declaration that said you have the same rights online as you do offline. Again, not shocking to any of us, but a major statement for the international community to make, and it's very important. We also need to provide support for individuals facing repression online and bolstering civil society's roles and policy-making processes, particularly with respect to the internet. And we also, in terms of the private sector aspect of this, encourage companies to adopt practices and policies that respect human rights online. There are a lot of good initiatives there. And we've had some real successes. I mentioned the Human Rights Council resolution, which I think was really a landmark decision. We launched something called the Freedom of Online Coalition back in 2011 in The Hague. That has 22 like-minded governments and growing from around the world who ascribe to a set of principles that endorses a free and open internet. That group is going to be meeting in Tallinn in April, so literally right after the Net Mondial conference. We're going to be having the Tallinn Internet Freedom Online Coalition meeting there. And so all of those things, I think, you know, having that like-minded group, growing that like-minded group, which is distributed around the world, and bringing other stakeholders together to advance those policies is also critically important. And both governments and industry have a role to play there as well. The fourth area is an area near and dear to my heart from my days at the Department of Justice and being a prosecutor doing cybercrime, is the serious threat that's posed by the explosion of various kinds of cybercrime. It is, you know, I think as all of you know, this has become really a transnational scourge and a real transnational issue that affects the global economy. And although estimates are, reliable estimates are hard to really come by, I think everyone agrees it's causing substantial damage in the billions of dollars and has, in some ways, even more importantly, reduced public trust in the internet, which is something none of us can afford. Some states, some countries believe that the answer to all of this is to have some giant UN one ring rules them all convention that deals with cybercrime. We do not. We have the Budapest Convention for Cybercrime that took 5 years, I should say, to negotiate. More countries are joining it all the time. Other countries are emulating its provisions. That's a very important cornerstone of our efforts, is to promote that. But we also need to do work to make sure countries have the capability, the law enforcement capability, the ability to cooperate internationally, and frankly, also the mindset to deal with stakeholders within their government, including the private sector, as we do in fighting cybercrime in the US. So that's all incredibly important. So as we think about the three legs of the stool here, one is having good substantive laws, two is having good procedural laws and the ability to actually investigate crimes, and then the third one is the ability to cooperate internationally, and we're working on all of those issues. Something I said? So in that area, particularly in that area, I talked about the Budapest Convention. Another thing we're doing is I used to chair the G8's high-tech crime group for about 10 years, and we created a 24/7 network in that context, which has over 60 countries in it, and is supposed to make these investigations move smoother throughout countries. And we've done a lot, and we're adding more countries, including Senegal, Colombia, Costa Rica, Morocco, and others to this network. And we also have been working a lot doing capacity building, both in here and what I'm going to talk about next, cybersecurity, where we have been, particularly in the African region, in different parts of Africa, Eastern and Western Africa, done a number of capacity building initiatives, where we also invite industry to be part of these initiatives, and we invite other countries as well, where we talk about some of the tools they need, some of the basic policies they need. And that's been very important, and we're going to do more of those. We're looking to do one in Southern Africa, we're looking to do one in Southeast Asia, and we'll be doing more. So that's something where I think that's a good point of collaboration between government and the private sector. And the final area is, and another area, it's not the final area, but another area is this idea of cybersecurity due diligence, we call it. And the reason we call it that is to separate it from the international security, which is more state-on-state issues. Cybersecurity due diligence is the kind of basic things that countries should be doing to heighten cybersecurity. Not just countries, but other actors and other actors within various countries. So it's things like doing national strategies to deal with cybersecurity, and that's something which more and more countries, I think there's more than 30 countries now that have national strategies. That heightens the profile of the issue, and it also makes sure all the different government agencies are working on this, and they're doing things like have a practice of dealing with the private sector. In many countries, that practice doesn't exist. They don't have a history of doing that, and so having these strategies and having these exercises that countries are going through are important. It's also building institutions like computer emergency response teams. It is taking steps to secure their own networks, which helps everyone in the world community. And again, this has been the focus of a lot of our capacity building work in Africa and Asia, and we'll be continuing to be part of that because I think that that's one of the core foundational elements that we're trying to achieve. And the final area is more generally the internet and cyberspace more generally as an engine of economic growth. So, I mean, all of you know the internet's been a major catalyst for economic and social growth around the world. Both through our diplomatic process, but also through initiatives like the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is a coordinated public-private civil society voice advocating for policy and regulatory best practices for expanding internet access. We are trying to pursue that because all of these things I talked about really don't matter to a country if they have no internet penetration, no internet access, and so we have to work on that. And that's something that we are working on the Global Broadband Initiative and other areas to try to advance that. So all of those different buckets of activities, in some ways are separate and involve different stakeholders, but in other ways are very related, or things that we're pursuing actively. And we're doing that through lots of different ways, including really stepping up our diplomatic efforts government to government. We have bilateral all-of-government dialogues now with a number of countries, including China, as I mentioned, but also with Brazil, and with South Africa, and with India, and with Germany, and with Japan, and with Korea, and more. We would do even more, but there's only so many of us to go around, even though we've grown. And this is really becoming again, a major policy issue where it's important for us to have these dialogues and not just have the dialogues between the foreign ministries or the defense ministries or the justice ministries, but do it in a more integrated fashion. And increasingly, like we did when we had the Brazilians here about 2 years ago, we want to make sure we bring the private sector in too. So we're looking at opportunities to do that in all these dialogues. So with that, I thought I'd pause, or stop, I guess, but pause to answer questions. And be happy to take any questions you have.
Let me start by saying thank you very much. And I am absolutely awed by the wide range of important topics that you have to deal with. They are interconnected, but they also, each of them is very significant and very important. With that in mind, I'll start with a joke, which it sounds like we could take a couple billion from NSA and give it to you to have more resources and solve part of the problem in your way.
We're very efficient in using our resources.
This is not all joking, but I guess I'll, however, say the following, which is we have had a lot of discussion about internet freedom and how we project it, and it's very critical, obviously, to our industry, and how important it is that the historic role of the U.S. as the creator and protector and defender of the internet, that the U.S. Private sector and the U.S. government are out there in the international world leading the fight. But it's also hard now to talk about that without realizing that the credibility of the government, because of surveillance in particular, but some other issues as well, as the defender of internet freedom is crippled, at least temporarily, and at least for a while, it seems like. So within the State Department, and look, we know the secretary's flying all over on other issues, but the truth is, it's hard to imagine how this issue gets the high level attention, and we need, I think, a voice from the State Department who recognizing how these issues need to be advanced from the freedom perspective, and we need the same from the Commerce Department and other places, so that in the highest councils of government there is an understanding that when these trade-offs are made, they're not narrow trade-offs, but they have broad strategic significance, the strategic importance of the internet, for all the reasons you said, from economic development and empowerment to just generally protecting free speech and an open, innovative climate of the internet. So I guess the question is, A, you've got so much on your plate. State Department has a lot on its plate. These issues are all, very core issues, are playing out in very near real time in international fora. What can we do in the private sector to help make sure that the administration is out there, aggressive enough, and to the extent we can enhance the credibility by perhaps the most significant steps to rebalance the surveillance equation. And all that, I think, is part of, they're intertwined, and it's not a pure question, but I think we're real concerned right now that the force of the battle that's going on for internet freedom, that it's not clear how it comes out.
Well, I think there's a huge commitment to this issue at the highest level, both of the State Department and the administration generally. I mean, this is not something that we take for granted in any way. And I could say that all of the different agencies I've been dealing with, whether it be Commerce, whether it be the White House, Michael Daniel and others in the White House, or it be within the State Department, this is seen to be a critical issue. I also would note that we don't try to do this alone even within the State Department. We work with different parts of the department, as we should as the coordinators. For instance, we have a very active democracy and human rights shop where the Assistant Secretary, Tom Malinowski, was just confirmed last week. So that's great, and I think he'll be a real strong leader on these issues too. And we are attending Enforce the Freedom Online Coalition. I don't completely agree that we've lost our moral high ground. I think that that's often the meme that comes out, but to be frank, what repressive governments are doing in terms of targeting citizens because of their political beliefs is far different than any kind of surveillance issue. And I think the president has made that clear. And the fact that the president gave a speech that talked about some of the reforms that he's undertaking is something that you would never see in a non-democratic society, and that's been very important too. As far as dealing with our allies in this issue, I think the key thing is to look at the core values we're trying to advance and what the stakes are. I mean, what are the stakes if we impose an intergovernmental system or a more repressive system or a balkanized system of the internet? What are the stakes for both economic growth and social growth? They're huge. And I think despite any issues that have come up over the last year, I think the like-minded countries understand that. And I think that's something we need to cultivate and continue to build. And I think that's important too. So on what industry can do or what the private sector can do, look, I think you guys do have a critical role to play. I mean, there's roles you have to play in existing groups like the GNI, within some of the access and affordability issues. But also, frankly, we always are very interested in hearing from you in terms of both things that are opportunities for us that we may be missing and that you may have more insight into than we do, because we don't have all the insight into everything, or where you think that there's something that's going off the rails that we should address. I mean, I've talked to a number of groups over the last couple of years where we really have made that point that we need to be working closely with you because you're out there in a lot of these international forums in a different way than we are, and so it's important to do that. So I'm I guess a bit more optimistic that we're going to prevail in this area, but yes, the challenges are out there, and the countries who have a different view of the internet have been emboldened for their own purposes. They are trying to sway the same group of countries, the developing world countries, who are really on the fence on a lot of these issues because they worry about stability issues, to be sure. But we have to make the case that this is an economic plus for them, that this is a social plus for them. And frankly, making that economic case is not just for government to make. That's a key thing for the private sector to make. So we welcome that kind of partnership. I will tell you, but I will tell you though, this is not something that is a what do you call like third tier issue within our government. This is something that there's a lot of attention on.
I don't want to monopolize too much, but I do want to do one follow-up. And my staff probably know the answer to this, but I haven't asked them the question. At what level of representation within the U.S. government is going to Brazil at the end of the month? How high?
That is still being decided right now. So I don't want to prejudge it before we say. But I would say we have a significant group of folks going, and we've had a significant involvement in the process for since really the beginning. So we have been working on this as a government, and I think we have a very strong delegation going, both to there and to the Freedom Online Coalition. I'm sorry?
It will be important how
Yes.
it's a signal of how seriously we take.
Yeah, well, we do take it seriously, and what we want to see is a real affirmation of this multi-stakeholder model.
Thank you very much for joining us today. The issues that you have to deal with in cybersecurity front, the international space, are very esoteric and very perplexing. One of the themes that
Not always, but
one of the themes that came up a couple times throughout your speech for confidence building or explosion of cybercrime or cybersecurity due diligence kind of harkens back to kind of an underlying issue here, which has always made the issues of cybersecurity relatively intractable, is that it's very difficult in the online space to kind of monitor the other side or kind of make sure they're living up to their commitments because deniability is high. I mean, the nature of the internet is it's decentralized and it's anonymous, and that's on purpose. And everybody always says, I mean, we've been hacked before by what we think would be politically motivated people, and there's like, oh no, that wasn't. We had nothing to do with that. That just came from some rogue element within our state. I mean, Russia basically invaded Estonia on the cyber front, 6-7 years ago, and completely denied it and said, "Oh, it's rogue elements within our state." So I was wondering, when you're going through these negotiations, when you're trying to establish rules or bilateral rules, what are the academic thoughts or the structural thoughts that go into framing that? Because one of the things you said is like the analogies between the Cold War or the nuclear proliferation and the internet world are not precise, but one of the things that comes up a lot is that kind of a prisoner's dilemma look at the world, and it's kind of depressing when you look at the internet world because it's everybody benefits from an open, free internet, but the incentives to cheat are very high for any individual party because it's very hard to detect them. So I was wondering how you kind of make people live up to their commitments, or any thoughts you have in moving down that path.
So, I mean, attribution has always been an issue in terms of accountability, and that's true. But however, there are things that you can pursue, just like we have been pursuing, where you bring a number of different tools to bear. And we say in our international strategy, if the threat is great enough, we'll use all the tools all the arrows in our quiver. We'll use diplomatic issues. We'll use economic tools. We'll use law enforcement tools. We may even use military tools as a last resort, but that really is a last resort, depending on if you have the fiery ball of cyber death coming toward you. But I think the key thing is there are ways to affect behavior. And for instance, if there is a country that we believe is, for instance, stealing intellectual property and doing it on a wholesale basis, part of that is making it clear that that's unacceptable and that we know where it's coming from and it needs to stop. And that's the diplomatic aspect. But then you also look at the different other tools you have in addressing that. And it's not just the U.S. I mean, you have to build a like-minded group or a coalition of countries who ascribe to certain norms of behavior and say that certain things are unacceptable. For instance, you've heard the president address that particular issue, the theft of intellectual property, even quite recently. He addressed it in a speech with respect to surveillance issues. I mean, this is something that we do not do and we don't find as acceptable, and I think we're promoting that around the world, and we should be. So the diplomatic aspect is one of them, and even if attribution is not perfect, and I would argue that sometimes attribution is more, you don't just have to attribute something online. There are other ways to do it too. Just like when you're doing a criminal investigation, you follow the money, you look at other things. You don't necessarily do it all on following the digital footprints. So although attribution poses a problem, it's not insurmountable in the sense that we can still use the diplomatic, law enforcement, and other tools we have. I'll tell you another thing that we've done recently, which I think was important. You all recall the denial of service attacks that were plaguing our financial sector for a pretty extended period of time. Well, one thing you do with respect to that is you try to build better defenses. You always try to harden the targets. That makes total sense. And you do that no matter what the threat is. And that's hard because defense is always difficult, and we all know that. But we also tried to build better cooperation. So what we did, in concert with our Department of Homeland Security, is we did something we'd never tried before, which was we went out first. I think most of you know what a botnet is. A botnet, a distributed denial of service attack. The compromised computers can be anywhere, and often are everywhere. And there could be concentrations that move day to day or week to week. You could have a whole bunch of them in Germany one day, and they could be in France the next day, or they could be in Indonesia the next day. Or they could be in the U.S., and they often are. So how do you counter that? Well, one thing we try to do is have our technical experts, and this is something we've done before, technical experts reach out to over 100 countries asking for better cooperation on these issues. But the new thing we tried is we did something diplomatically. We went to over 20 governments, 25, and said, look, we did what's called a démarche. And in diplomatic language, I always thought, coming from the non-diplomatic sphere, démarche always sounded really harsh to me. It sounded like it's something like you're yelling at someone. But a démarche can be positive or negative. And these were positive démarches. These were saying to countries, look, we made a technical request. And sometimes there wasn't a technical counterpart. They didn't have a cert, for instance. They haven't built that institution yet. So we can go to the foreign ministry through a démarche and other places in the government through a démarche and say, this really matters. We need your help with this. We need your cooperation. And of course, we have to be willing to reciprocate. And the point of that is to build better international cooperation, really a more unified cooperation internationally against these kinds of threats. And I think we had a lot of success with that. So that was a new thing we tried, marrying the diplomatic and the technical together. And that's another way you can combat some of these threats. You get countries who are affected by them because all these countries where the botnets were located, there was illegal activity happening on their soil, so they had an incentive to do something about it. So that was another thing we tried. So, I think there's a number of ways that we approach this. Yes, you don't have verification like you do in the nuclear world. You don't see a launch plume, and you don't know exactly what's going on. But you have a lot of material that you can pursue. And I think we're still in the relative beginning days of all this, but I think we're making some progress on that.
I think the word démarche, depending on whose voice is speaking, it can sound lovely. If it's in the voice of a French lady, it sounds fantastic.
Yes. Voice of an American sounds good.
But my real question was just going right back to the beginning of your comments. You talked about the number of states that have now put in place some kind of code with regard to cybersecurity and related matters. And you talked about the growing efforts at collaboration between the United States and quite a long list of countries. And it seemed, listening to you, that the development of international cooperation you expect it to be fairly linear. In other words, we now have a good dozen, 20, and that we'll relatively easily get to hundreds of countries cooperating on these issues. Is that the case, or am I being over-optimistic? And what road bumps do you see in terms of establishing very broad cooperation on these important issues?
So I'd love that to be the case, but I think there are challenges. And I think one of the challenges is quite simply a lot of the developing world doesn't have these institutions in place. They're getting far more broadband access now. I mean, for instance, one of the capacity building efforts we did was in Nairobi 2 years ago in partnership with the government of Kenya, but for the 10 East African countries. Kenya, as you may know, got a cable drop a couple of years ago, and they have an exploding mobile broadband market, including mobile broadband payment, something called M-Pesa, that frankly was more advanced than we had in the US, which kind of was interesting. So they were trying to build some of these security and other aspects in from the ground floor, which is, so it's not that the U.S. should go and we should never go and sort of preach to these countries. We're saying, here's what's worked for us, here's what didn't work, learn from our example, and we're there to try to help you to the extent we can. And I think countries have to, build capability, and this is true in all these spheres. Law enforcement too. A lot of countries don't have the legal base, the strong laws in place yet. They may not have the trained law enforcement to pursue it. There are elements that they still need, and it's understandable, especially a lot of these countries are dealing with a host of different challenges, but this is a really important one, and we need to build them. So it's not, I don't think you can just leapfrog from X countries to everyone right away. I think you have to build that capability and capacity and understanding of these issues. And I think it's important for all these countries to have a voice in a lot of the deliberations that are going on and be part of some of the decision-making process. Right? Yes, that's fine. Good seeing you.